Oregon lawmakers are discussing bills that address political extremism and domestic terrorism.
The proposals follow unrest in Oregon in recent years, along with the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Fox 12's Bonnie Silkman joins us now live in studio with the idea behind these bills and what exactly they would do. Bonnie?
Yeah, good morning. Lawmakers are hoping that these bills will help deter people from committing domestic terrorism. When discussing the proposals, lawmakers mentioned a 2022 Oregon Secretary of State audit that found that Oregon had the 6th highest number of domestic violent extremism incidents in the nation from 2011 to 2020. So House Bill 2772 would make domestic terrorism a felony, punishable by 10 years in prison, a $250,000 fine, or both. This would apply to an individual, someone acting alone, or to a group of people. The bill defines domestic terrorism as intentionally attempting to cause catastrophic harm that results in extraordinary levels of death, injury, property damage, or disruption of daily life. It also says domestic terrorism severely impacts the population, infrastructure, environment, economy, or government functioning of Oregon. Now, we heard from the state representative who supports this bill, along with the Multnomah County District Attorney, Mike Schmidt.
I do believe this bill has the potential to create a relief valve ahead of what could be an increasingly violent political election cycle and keep our state from descending into the further cycles of violence and chaos.
By the time the violence erupts, we're already too late. I've prosecuted violent protesters from across the ideological spectrum and will continue to do so whenever necessary. But those prosecutions have taught me that we are poorly served to simply wait for violence to happen.
Another proposal, House Bill 2572, would address the threat and damages that people face from paramilitary activity involving a group of 3 or more people who illegally prevent others from accessing public areas or exercising their lawful rights, like voting. The report also urged lawmakers to take action, as Oregon is one of just 16 states without a definition of domestic terrorism in the law. Now, we'll be keeping a close eye on these discussions around these proposals and keep you updated. Back to you.